Hi everyone, welcome to Kunstinstitut's Melli's conference, a conference called Effective Graphic Design. We are very happy to be organizing this from Rotterdam and to have you all here on site. And I'm also welcoming the audience that is connected online, either through our website, kunstinstituutmelli.nl, and also through the YouTube channel of our institutional partner in this conference, the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht, of which we have today a curator from there, Bruno, visiting us, and I'm very happy that you're here. My name is Sofia Hernandez Choncuy, and I'm the director of Kunstinstitut Melli. And I just want to give you a brief of why we organized this conference. The idea really came at the start of this year when we had just launched our new visual identity, which we will hear about today at 5 p.m. And the visual identity, of course, came with the renaming of our institution from Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art to Kunstinstitut Melli. And we had passed through a very important year of a lot of learnings, but certainly had been working very closely with 6 graphic designers that were enrolled at Werkplaats Typografie in Arnhem, and that had, together with us and together with workshops, actually from Prem, from workshops at Design Studio in Berlin and New York, had been discussing questions around identity and typography, and certainly how and what we wanted to communicate. We learned a lot through that process, and we stayed with a lot of interest in learning more. And so this conference is organized as a way to make public some of those learnings and to be able to learn collectively more about graphic design and its intersection with the visual arts. The conference comprises, as you may know, keynotes like the one that we'll be listening today of Prem Krishnamurthy. This is the 4th of 4 keynotes that the conference has been presenting. We had 2 keynotes presented yesterday. They all focus on an exemplary figure that has informed graphic design, whether from the visual arts or from the design world. We had the first presentation done by Irene Small, and that was how we inaugurated the conference. And she did a very analytical approach to a work by Ligia Clark, the Brazilian artist, and understood the position of that work to provide what you would call a working tool to think about our contemporaneity and to look back into modernism and to reflect critically on what happened and what were some of the voids that has to be addressed today. She called this the organic line that she drew from the work and practice of Ligia Clark. After her, the second keynote was Cuauhtémoc Medina, the chief curator at MUAC in Mexico City. And by the way, Irene Small was connecting from the United States at the Clark Institute, where she's doing a sabbatical as an art historian. In the case of Cuauhtémoc Medina, he was connecting from Mexico City. He's the chief curator there at the Museum of Contemporary Art at UNAM, the university in Mexico, the biggest national university. And he's also one of the key researchers at the Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas there. That museum where he chief curates had an exhibition about Vicente Rojo, a graphic designer who was extremely prolific during the 20th century in Mexico and up until his death in March earlier of this year, almost at the age of 90. Vicente Rojo designed hundreds and hundreds of books. The presentation of Cuauhtémoc focused very much on his work with visual artists and also with poets. Vicente Rojo, in addition, had his own printing press. He had his own editorial house. He was pretty much what Cuauhtémoc called a monopoly of visual culture for the intelligentsia in Mexico, and particularly of the left during the last number of decades. The third keynote, those that were here with us this morning or connected online, was given by Nina Paim, who was connecting from Basel in Switzerland. And Nina Paim is a co-founder of Future S, and she's a graphic designer herself. And she selected to focus her lecture on Maria Vieira, and someone very similar in terms of a personal background in history as Nina Paim, a Brazilian that moved to Basel, and whose work was difficult to categorize between being an artist, as a visual artist in terms of sculpture, or a landscape designer, or a critical thinker, or pedagogue in design, or of course, for what Maria Vieira is, kind of figure, and she takes a very terminology that Maria Vieira used to define herself, which was an ideadora, an idea person that came to do a number of things. We were really able to explore that transnationalism and the questions of belonging that the passionate research that Nina Paim has done had done of Maria Vieira, but we also saw that a sense of transnationalism, the questions of belonging, and the way that design figures into all of this as a communication a catalyzer in the last panel. And that last panel was moderated by Yinyin Wong, and it's the second of 3 panels that this conference organizes. So now that is a bit of a summary. I'm going to tell you just a bit to say that this conference, even if the ideas were earlier on, it really got shaped by the conversations we had with a number of people, and initially with Prem Krishnamurthy, who from the early draft of the conference itinerary had already made significant critiques so that it could be improved and become not just more global but also more critical. So I'm very happy that he participated in the shaping of that through, again, informal conversations that were certainly very informative. The same with Thomas Castro, who's unfortunately unable to join us today because of a personal emergency, and certainly with Yinyin Wong, that organized and also moderates a number of the panels. I want to, before passing the microphone to Prem, who's just arrived to Rotterdam, and we're very happy that he's back with us, I want to take the opportunity to thank a number of people beside having acknowledged Yin, Prem, and Thomas in shaping the conference. I want to thank Pilar Matadupont, who together organized the conference and has made everything work out perfectly. I want to also thank Jeroen Lavin, who's behind the monitors there, together with Prem, and he will be moderating a panel at 5 p.m. He's a close colleague, as it is Lynn Kramer, Angelique Kool, Paul Van Hennep, Julia Munichuka, Gabi Dow, and Marianne Van Ham, who have been really organizing with us every detail of this conference. Finally, Wusuk Yang is here, and he designed the typography of this conference, effective graphic design that you could all see, so we're very happy that Wusuk is also joining us. So now on to Prem Krishnamurthy. He is the founder and principal leader, together with another colleague, of Workshops, which is spelled without nouns, and which office began in New York and now also in Berlin. Prem Krishnamurthy has been working in graphic design for many years now as Workshops, before as projects, and he has also had a very expansive practice where curating, lecturing, teaching have all come to the fore through, I would say, spatializing ideas very much as we do it. We worked with Prem in the last year, and I just want him to go on with his talk. Are you ready, Prem? Yeah, great. So Prem will be speaking of Karel Martens. As you know, he is an important figure here in the Netherlands, but also he's someone whose work I got to know in an exhibition that was very important for both Prem and Karel Martens that took place at P! Which is a space that was founded by Prem Krishnamurthy in New York City and that ran as a storefront for projects for many years. So Prem, please join us. Thank you so much for making the wait to Rotterdam, and we're happy to listen to you.
Thank you, Sophia, for that warm and generous introduction. I also want to thank Pilar for all of her help, and of course to Dutch KLM and the Dutch Rails for letting me get here almost on time. I think I will just note, as Sophia introduced this, Sophia reached out to me sometime in early of 2021 and said, Prem, we're planning a conference on graphic design. We would like you to prepare a talk on Karel Martens. And I said, well, you know that I like letters very much, so it seems very appropriate that the newly named Kunstinstitut Melli should also have a talk on Karel Martens. Dear, dear Karel, it's been too long. How is Luce doing? Emily and I think of her constantly. How I miss the days of us traveling to see your shows and the whole Martens clan in Amsterdam or München or Ghent or elsewhere. At the moment, it feels like such a rare privilege to meet in person, though hopefully that will change soon. Am I controlling this or not? Okay. But I can't use this as a monitor, I suppose. I can't see it on here. It's okay. My eyesight has gotten so much worse in recent years. Recently, I've been reflecting on our times together. I'm pretty sure the first time we met was an asynchronous encounter, to use the terminology of the moment. It was on my first trip from Berlin to the Netherlands in 1997. Don't worry, Karel. I'm not trying to test your memory. We didn't actually meet in person, but I just met a small, widely distributed part of you. Your ubiquitous, richly overprinted Dutch telephone cards. I don't even think I knew they were designed by you yet, but I did need to call my mother. She has a fascination with numbers too, so I told her all about them. 1. My mother's degree in mathematics and her work in robotics in the 1980s and 1990s are a note I've tried to hit in most every public talk I've delivered for the past decade. The fact that she shares a penchant for ascribing meaning to numbers with KM is a happy coincidence here. The second meeting. With the second printing of your printed matter, Drukwerk, which I might have also bought in the Netherlands on that trip. I'm not entirely sure, since I've owned several copies of the book from different editions. They each show their wear. That book must have made you many distant friends by now. The third time? It's a good thing that you reminded me. It was at Yale in 1999, when apparently I was dancing wildly at a year-end design party. My recollection of that night lies somewhere between foggy and non-existent, but dear Luce snapped a photo. It must have been memorable, because the next time we met, in early 2000, when I paid a visit to the Werkplatz typography in its early days, you recognized my moves. Time's flow can feel so uneven. It seems like several lifetimes from then until our more substantial encounters. In Arnhem in either 2006 or 2007, and later again in summer 2012, when I called you out of the blue, introduced myself as that dancing guy with a design studio in New York, and explained my intention to open an experimental gallery in Manhattan. My ask: could I come visit your studio in Amsterdam? Perhaps we could present your legendary, yet still rarely shown, letterpress monoprints in the gallery's first exhibition. Your response: why not? That's when and where our story truly begins. What an epic visit. I was so curious to understand how you create your monoprints and what motivates the process. over multiple coffees, handling your metal printing pieces, sheafing through your prints from over 6 decades, and all the while, deep in discussion about the merits of the color green versus the color blue, the complexities of layered inks and overlapping forms, one set of motifs or another. The question came up, do you prefer to call yourself an artist or a designer? Neither, you replied. How can anyone be described by a single professional name? Being called a designer is limiting, and I like the term artist even less. Several years later, in the run-up for our project together in Berlin, I remember you extended this statement to its logical conclusion. I'm a human being, Prem. How do you feel about the term independent graphic designer? I've never used it myself, but I have a sense that it's been popular amongst younger practitioners for the past decade or two. A quick Google search from where I am reveals 165,000 results. I'm curious, does anyone here in the room call themselves an independent graphic designer? No hands. Well, probably good. What is it about independence that's so appealing to folks? It's been used to describe both graphic designers who work on their own rather than in a larger agency or studio, as well as for curators who are freelancers instead of employees at museums or art institutions. Also, for folks whose political leanings don't line up with one party or another. During my second visit to Arnhem in 2006 or 2007, and I'll admit my memory of that decade is very fuzzy, the students from Artes kept hounding my then design partner, Adam, and me to talk about our, quote, autonomous projects and our, quote, independent work. By this, they meant our design work outside of client-driven contexts. The repeated questions drove us crazy. Maybe a bit like the question, are you a designer or an artist for you? For years, we had argued, in word and in deed, that there's no autonomous work, no independent labor. Nothing is without context and constraints. An artist making paintings alone in their studio is still reliant on others. It might not look the same as client-driven graphic design work, yet it sits on the spectrum of contingency. Human endeavor is intrinsically social. The claim that things are autonomous, alone, unconnected from other things is a powerfully persuasive and destructive modern myth. My friend Asad Raza, also incidentally a human being, locates the idea of separation as underlying so many contemporary crises. Everything I can think of in this world stands in relation to other things. Nothing is independent. Rather, it's all interdependent. You've acknowledged this yourself, Karel, in not so many words. And so I have a desire today to explore the idea of design and interdependence in your work for a little while. Let's see how this lands. In some of your projects, I see this at work at multiple scales. For example, in the layering of voices, gestures, agencies, and time periods of this piece. The temporary visual identity that you created for the launch of Het Nieuwe Instituut in Rotterdam. Translating the merger of 3 existing institutions into a visual vocabulary, your approach of 3 overlaid dots repurposes what was already there. It's simple yet pitch perfect, building upon the printed materials of the previous constituent institutions by overprinting and die-cutting them. It's also a small gesture of sustainability. Instead of simply throwing out perfectly good printed paper, the system accepts that what came before also has value. It applies a conceptual principle of continuity on a practical level. Everything emerges from something that came before. Interdependence, which allows for both collective and individual identities, also applies to other aspects of your practice. From your signature overprinted fluorescent colors, which generate intense combinations while also retaining the legibility of each single hue, to your manner of working with others. I'm thinking of the many talented students from the Werkplatz typography who assisted you to design Oase. As well as your continued collaborations with your children. For example, those stunning Maharam textiles with ever-cool Klarcha. Your ongoing work with the amazing Aksha for so many kinds of client-based graphic design work. And of course, lovely, sweet Diederik, whom I seem to chat with most often about the realization of your interactive installations, exhibitions, and public projects. "9 years ago, when you and I first started making exhibitions together, I had assumed that our studio models were diametrically opposed. Here I was, at the time, running a successful New York graphic design studio with 16 to 20 people computing away daily. Yet you had famously maintained your independence by working solo or with an assistant or two, max. A part of me was embarrassed to talk with you about this. Yet, by and by, I began to realize that these two approaches had much more in common than was apparent at first. For example, at projects, now workshops, I tried to give agency to the designers working with me. I might frame a project's agenda or give folks feedback, but I rarely pushed things down a prescriptive path unless we were on the verge of abject failure, which happened a couple times. From our conversations, I've understood that your way of working with students and collaborators is similar. You've talked about wanting to be surprised by what comes out of each situation, of wanting to learn something new out of uncertainty. Who knows how your colleagues experienced it, but this process sounds pretty familiar to me. A mix of the practical and the pedagogical, experimental and applied, and an acceptance of the entangled nature of it all, was embedded within the founding ethos of the Werkplatz typography, as I understand it. Even if the school has changed over the past 20-plus years, its initial intentions resonate strongly with what my colleagues and I had hoped to accomplish in New York. Let's see if I can read this. Werkplatz typography. In 1997, reflecting on many years of graphic design teaching, quote, close to the press, and experiences with postgraduate design education, KM initiated with Vigor Birma the Werkplatz typography workshop at Arnhem. Turning its back on the clamor for, quote, theory, the Werkplatz is a strictly practical postgraduate studio environment to which all participants, students and teachers, bring their own graphic design projects and commissions to work on and to discuss thoroughly. As a matter of principle, they work for production of real artifacts. The conversations across generations run in multiple directions as well. I've appreciated not only our discussions of teaching and studio practice, but also hearing how your intersections with older designers, such as Wim Krauwe, influenced your path, even if you were clear on what you wanted to do differently. Although I've never been able to secure an actual copy of it, much too expensive to buy used, I have a feeling that the 432-page book, 7, a good page count for a book. It turns out that 432 equals 108 times 4. That you and Jaap van Triest created for and about Vim represents a moment of two different systems colliding, your own sensibility with that of your subject. This kind of situation goes far beyond the stereotypical power dynamics of client and designer. It's not unidirectional by any means. I imagine that there was a lot more back and forth, give and take, to make this project happen. Yet, even when I think about your most renowned, quote, independent or free work, the letterpress monoprints, developed over decades through a daily practice, made alone in your studio, almost as a form of meditation, I'm hard-pressed to understand them as existing autonomously. First, there's their economy. Originally, the monoprints were works that you gave away to students and friends as gifts. And gifts, especially when given freely, create bonds and communities with others. Plus, interdependence is also embedded on a historical level. As you yourself pointed out to me so many years ago, the old Stedelijk Museum acquisition cards, retrieved from the trash can in the early 1990s during your work on the Karel monograph, were most likely designed by Willem Sandberg. Another conversation between makers and forms across time. And, on a material level, I remember now how, during one of our first visits, you mentioned offhand that the paper upon which you print might also be called your collaborator. Perhaps it was the limits of language, the challenges of translation, that produced this surprising formulation. And yet, upon reflection, I found it remarkably apt. You often select your papers with great sensitivity towards their pre-existing graphics and the writing they already carry. Even if you rarely print specifically in reaction to them, too direct, you once told me, it's a layer of meaning that your prints must integrate. Furthermore, each paper possesses its own finish, its own sheen, its own color, its own haptic quality, and its texture. Such non-standardized surfaces receive ink differently, producing unexpected results. Standing in the studio with you, holding papers to the light at different angles, seeing how each takes the ink in its own way, an utterly unreproducible experience. So, it can sometimes seem like the paper itself takes on agency in the process of becoming a Karl Martens monoprint. Each unique print features a different sheet underneath its ink layers. Often, the paper's provenance is credited. So from this perspective, being used in a print saves the paper from the recycling bin. Might this count as a performance? Are the sheets themselves actors within the work that we call yours? Discards appearances, layers intersections, agency and accident, juxtaposition and generation, overlappings, contrasting tempos. Time and time again, I return to your short animated video from the late 1990s, not for resale. The piece is structured so simply. It starts from Klaartje's photograph of your soon-to-be-abandoned studio in Hoog Koppel and the cluttered pin-up wall there. Intended as a way to share your work with students at the Jan van Eyck Academy, Not for Resale assembles a rapid-fire palimpsest of your work and some of the many things that you have collected. So, Jeroen, would you mind clicking on that image? Thank you. And just showing that full screen. It's not synced here anymore. Thank you. I'll read from here in the meantime. Watching the video, again for the umpteenth time, I find its sheer scale of reference, from the political events of the day down to the printed experiments on your wall, a powerful demonstration of the porosity of self and artistic creation. To be Karel and to make the work of Karel is also to be many people and things and events and ideas all at once. Phew. That last piece deserves a deep breath. I'd encourage you all, stand up if you can. Whew. So, thanks, Karel, for joining me on this trip down interdependency lane. I hope you can appreciate this partial catalog of the interconnections between your individual work and the world outside. Perhaps I'm projecting, but within your work and its generosity, I also get a glimpse of how each of us is constituted within and through our diverse relationships with others. 10. The typeface used for this section is Pirelli, designed by KM and Jungmung Lee in 2017 to 18. It was based on an anonymous grotesque and features extremely high-waisted characters such as capital E, F, and P. I've never used this typeface before, but I'm happy to test drive it here as the document shifts presentational modes into a slightly different register. So that's the thing about collaboration and interdependency, Karel. They mark and change everyone involved in more and less visible ways, as they have me as well. Do you remember when we were first hanging your prints in the first P show, Process 01 Joy, back in September 2012? It was the first time they'd been shown in nearly 20 years. The wall-your framed monoprints, it looks so pristine in the final install shots, but let's not forget, it was a pretty bumpy process. I mean, in my memory of it, during our first studio visit, I asked you specifically if you had an idea for how to show the prints, and you said, I already made the work. You're the curator. You can hang it however you want. Foolish, naive me. I mean, it was one of the first shows I'd curated, let's be honest. So I took you at your word, and so I had the work framed and hung in what I thought was a kind of salon-style approach, clustered together around a central axis. And then I made a really useful rookie mistake. I mean, do you remember I sent you these 2 bad snapshots of the install? Email, 11 September 2012, 3:46 p.m. Dear Karel, some snapshots of the installation. Hope you're well. All best, P. You responded with a note of uncertainty, and then we talked on the phone. It looks old-fashioned, like my grandmother's wall. I mean, and I tried to persuade you that the loose layout, it mirrored your studio pinup wall, and blah, 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 and you didn't sound very convinced. A couple days later, you emailed me again to make it very clear that the layout had to change. 13. Email, 13 September 2012, 9:03 a.m. Dear Prem, I am very sorry, but after 2 nights sleeping, I still have an uncomfortable feeling about the layout of the wall. Let us change it. Again, I am very sorry and hope that you can understand. All the best. Karel. I'm not gonna lie, I was upset, disappointed, and super stressed out. I mean, there was just so much other work to do, both at the gallery, this was our first show ever, and also at our always too busy studio. So how could we possibly reinstall your work so close to the opening? It was a major ask. I mean, thankfully, my then girlfriend, who was also an artist who sometimes could be quite picky, she suggested a surefire tactic, that I should put the responsibility back on you and say, well, if you want to change it, then you have to come today to New York and look at it together. And so you arrived that evening after a full day of teaching in New Haven, and at my Bowery studio, we played around with printouts and an elevation. Instead of clustering the works, we distributed them across the width of the wall into columns and rows, and then we moved some works up to flirt with the top margin. You had a reputation for always having a tight top margin in your work. And it ended up creating structure, tension, and composition. I mean, I know that I learned a lot from the exercise, and to be honest, it was a lot better. On Saturday morning, just a day before the gallery's public opening, you returned and we rehung the wall together in a super decisive way. I mean, it was interesting. When it came to making exhibitions, I found that you were much more relaxed than I had expected. I mean, I still was back then a major perfectionist, but you could let things be looser. You were not a perfectionist about where things should land. You were open to change and opportunity and improvisation, the unexpected. You might say the show was a success. And contrary to all the expectations going in, it wasn't a one-off in terms of our relationship. I mean, instead, it became the beginning of a long dialogue. I mean, first of all, do you remember all the places that reviewed your work in that show? I mean, there's a full list somewhere, and it sounds like bragging to even mention them right here. But it ended up leading to us showing your monoprints everywhere, at art fairs in Miami, London, Mexico City, in museums, at the Harvard Carpenter Center, Art Institute of Chicago. I mean, for a couple of years, at least from my limited perspective, it seemed like you were everywhere. Karel, I'm never going to forget that final season of P in 2016 to 2017, right before we closed. Your solo show was the best possible kickoff. I mean, we worked on that project for so long. Remember how we prototyped every part of the fabrication in New York? We figured out how to make the clock mechanism. We figured out a new way to mount the prints. We figured out all the tech on the interactive icon viewer. It was like a little museum show in like 35 square meters. Plus, it was reviewed super widely and nearly sold out. I mean, critical and commercial success hand in hand. Go us. We kicked ass. But, okay, to be fair, you probably noticed that it wasn't always easy for me to play the role of your ambassador, as you called me. I mean, AKA your gallerist and your dealer. I mean, I also have an independent streak. I love making exhibitions, but I never plan to get too mixed up in the commercial art world or representing artists with all of the responsibility it entails. But even if I was a reluctant art dealer going in, I also had a hunch that turned out right. I mean, paper is an ephemeral medium. It disappears very quickly, not like pottery or ceramics or other things. And my humble goal was to help preserve work like yours, as well as to rewrite historical hierarchies of art and design, particularly in the post-war period. And so I thought, well, this is a world that values economics above all. And so maybe one way to ensure that your work, and by extension the work of other designers, would be safeguarded properly would be to give it a good financial value. And the strategy, I thought, it would enable this work to be collected not on the margins or as an afterthought, but rather as an essential and integrated part of the ongoing history of art and human culture. So, I'm not going to lie, there's a part of me that takes pride in the fact that thanks to the work we did together, nowadays if somebody browses in, say, the Walker Art Collection in Minneapolis's collection for pieces from the 1950s and 1960s, they'll find early Karl Martens monoprints next to John Cage, Ellsworth Kelly, and other more household names. So, even though my days as an amateur gallerist are now years behind me, let me be even more transparent. My role as presenter and framer of your work, Karel, is also entangled with your story. This position is neither neutral nor impartial. I am not, cannot ever be, an independent observer. Why does one present something in the first place, if not out of some kind of interest, some resonance, some bodily urge, some passion or curiosity that traces a line along a surface? I think you know this even better than I, Karel. For decades, you've encouraged your students to find and follow their curiosity. you've made your own creative life out of pursuing only projects that speak directly to your concerns and the joy that you find within making things every day. And so, I don't think it'll come as a surprise that, like every other engaged graphic designer or curator or pursuer of knowledge or human who is joyous, I come to my chosen work, my work with you, Karel, not with academic distance or calculated interest, but rather out of love. Oh, Karel, there's still so many things to talk about. I mean, there's so many stories that have gathered up to recount and laugh over. Like, do you remember the first time you sang karaoke down there on Broome Street? But let's stay in the here and now. Every endeavor entails constraints of time and space, openings and closings. Did I mention earlier my love of numbers, which I believe echoes your own? For this particular communique, in line with recent others, I'm holding myself to a count of 108 pages. It may sound arbitrary, and yet it's as good, or perhaps even better, a number as other available options. 18. Googling, quote, "Why is the number 108 important in Hinduism?" yields both far-fetched and insightful results. One of my favorites, and I have to admit funniest, is by Rachna Mehta on Quora. So, while this may risk getting me canceled by even suggesting this thought exercise, I'm just going to encourage you to imagine a deep subcontinental twang reading this entry aloud, lack of definite articles and all. Ever heard of the mysticism of numbers? 108 is one such number that will leave you thinking about its endless mysticism. Do you think it is pure science? Probably more than what mathematics is. I will talk about Vedas first, with regards to this number, because that includes facts related to science, mathematics, astrology, numerology, community, cultures, etc. I personally think that the concept of this 108 number is even beyond time. Vedic mathematics. This number 108 contains all the numbers within. Any number that adds to number 9 gives the same number. Example, 15 equals 1 plus 5 equals 6. 15 plus 9 equals 24 equals 6. Even if you multiply any number with 9 and then add the digits, gives number 9. Example, 20 times 9 equals 180 equals 9. 99 times 9 equals 891 equals 9. 35 times 9 equals 315 equals 9 only. You can access the whole article on Quora. Please also note that the number of this footnote is 18. What do you think it adds up to? You know I always value your honest criticism and feedback, Karel, like the feedback you gave me in Amsterdam after I first performed what later evolved into P!DF at De Appel. I can only imagine that you might have some thoughts about my interpretations of and musings upon your life's work here today. So let me leave you with the QR code to access this whole letter online, where you can always add feedback or comments. Feel free to access it there on Google Drive, and anything you want to leave would be welcome. As you know all too well by now, Karel, It's only a matter of time until there's another, newer version. In the meanwhile, I can't wait to see you and the family in person very soon. There's so much for us to catch up on and continue in our conversation. I'm already counting the hours. With love, Prem. P.S. Karel, I was just flipping again through reprinted matter, and as usual, you already said what just took me over 100 pages much, much more simply and succinctly than I ever could. Martens. The best things happen when two people are heavily dependent on each other. Thank you again to Sofia Hernandez-Chonghui, Pilar Mata-Dupont, and the Kunstinstitut Melli team for both inviting me and hosting me for this talk.
Okay, so we're going to begin a Q&A after an epistolary exchange or an epistolary format.
You're a fan of epistolary
I'm a fan of epistolary writing, indeed, and we did an exhibition here a couple of years ago. Epistolary writing is we were unable to translate it actually to the Dutch because here the brief is called a letter, and so there is no genre spoken of the briefen. But anyhow, I am a fan of epistolary, and I already have a question around that in terms of Karel's own response and trajectory. And I feel that a lot of the things that we saw from Karel in terms of his practice and that you've mentioned or alluded to in your epistolary presentation speak to him definitely in different capacities. I think that even the fact that he doesn't like to be either called an artist or a graphic designer also indicates the fluidity in which he moves. But it leaves us, or it leaves me to ask you the question to the way he has been influential to other generations of graphic designers beyond, or to graphic designers in general beyond you. And that has to do with his pedagogical work. And you mentioned New Haven, which refers to Yale University, of course, as a location. And you've mentioned the Workplatz in Arnhem as another location, but have only kind of surrounded the idea around him being there. I would like to ask you a little bit about what is in this, what Nina Paim earlier called passionate research, and you call an interest out of love. I want to get a sense of how does this relationship of teacher and student, not that it means master and apprentice, because you've always collaborated as peers. How did Karel Martens set up a pedagogy with and about graphic design that informed you as a younger practitioner earlier in the days? And then we could speak more also about this lack of definition in roles that you also have very much taken up on your own. No? But first, just to get an understanding, what is a kind of pedagogy that he represents for you and perhaps other generations of designers, whether in the Netherlands or abroad, in the United States?
Well, I think the first thing to say, and maybe I will just hold this, it's a little easier. Yeah. My answer by necessity is 100% projection, because I was never Karel's student. I've never experienced his pedagogy beyond the experiences we had of making things together and feeling like I learned a lot from that, and from speaking with former students of his. I'm sure that they have wildly different experiences. I have met students who love Karel. I've met students who are critical of his teaching. And I've never I'm not a scientist or an academic, and I've never tried to do an oral history of it, though I know that some exist. But what I can say is, I mean, one anecdote that is both in reprinted matter or in printed matter, and that Karel and I were speaking about recently, was that when he first started teaching, think in 1977 in Arnhem at the Art Academy, he must have been in his late 30s. And one of the things that he did with the students was that he gave them an assignment, and he himself, as the teacher, did the assignment. And that was meant to kind of level the playing field a bit and to say, well, I'm also just a person who's going to respond to this. And again, I can't speak to this from the experience of actually having learned with him, but that gesture is so kind of about creating a more lateral relationship between student and teacher, one of peers. And I mean, I think that he mentions this, or it is mentioned, I should say, because it's really, as I understand it, Robin Kinross who wrote all or most of those captions for the first edition of Printed Matter. In the Werkplatz typography, when it was first established by him and Viggo Bierma in 1998, my understanding is that both of them, they had their own projects and they brought them into the Werkplatz, and then the students also brought their projects and did them. And so there was a sense that, and he's always said to me, he said, well, the reason why I love teaching, I learn so much from my students because each student has a totally different perspective. And I think on another level, what I can say is that, again, I speak only anecdotally in a way, but I think there's so many practitioners who either studied at Yale or at the Werkplatz who have become part of the generation over the last 20 plus years who really have actively and often intentionally, with purpose, moved between the worlds of art and design as they're currently formulated and constructed. And so many of them have either directly been people who studied with Karel or people who intersected with him in one way or another as either students or colleagues. The last thing I'll say in this already longer than I expected answer is that my impression of Karel when I first encountered his work in the 1990s through his books and was radically different than actually knowing Karel. I mean, I think I was you asked me what attracted you to his work, and I think it was back then was a certain formal quality, was a certain rigor in the graphic approach. It was just a sense of pure visual joy that came out of the work. But I thought it was much more rigorous and maybe dogmatic than it turned out to be when I met him. And of course, Karel, like any person, has his own dogmas or his own rules and his own structures. But in my experience of him, I've found him to be remarkably open to other ways of doing things and other ways of moving.
I think that that's interesting that you also speak about dogma and joy, and that you begin your lecture asking whether anyone in the room classifies themselves as an independent graphic designer. But certainly since the early 1990s, independent as a prefix of your formation has been there, and it is used to speak to the fact that it is not client-based, right? Meaning that it involves both, or rather study-based, but that it involves both clients that you choose and also passion projects that you develop. And I'm using that passion projects from Nina Pime's independent research beyond her studio practice. Yesterday we had a presentation by Laumes, the graphic designers, actually they're not exactly even, I shouldn't even say, Victoria and
human beings.
Victoria, who studied architecture, and Goda, who went to the Werkplatz, are the both constituting Laumes, and they created our graphic design the past 3 years before we renamed our institution. And last night, as part of this conference, they presented one of the projects that they developed on their own about plastic, and of which they did a book published by Bon Dia, which is Manuel Ryder's own publishing house. And with that, continuing this discussion of whether you create out of joy and not just out of commission. I think that that's, to me, is one of the things that really speaks to much of the work that you've done and how you've been approaching Karel Martens as well. But this leads me to come to one of the aspects that you mentioned in the conference that I'm not sure if I'm totally agree. I know why you say that it was important to create value in his work, of which you spoke about, I think, financial value in the work of Karel Martens so that it could be recognized. And in the last day and a half in this conference, and certainly for many years at this institution, there has been work done, academic research or passion projects that that tried to create a framework and an audience for the work of people that have been under-recognized. And that, in 1992 was Eliot Tisica, or in 2019 was Cecilia Vicuña, or most recently Maria Vieira with Nina Pine's presentation of her keynote earlier today. So the value that is being created is done through framing the practice or the work of that artist or of that maker that is the focus as a reference to understanding our current present and to understand the communities that were formed from the knowledge or the gatherings or the work that that person had done at a given time had at a moment or has today. So again, all this value and recognition is generated through the frameworks and the contextualization that that a voice or an institution provides, meaning value comes as reference. And so to me, the question to you is whether, I know it's a tricky question and you can circle it if you want, but is why were you so attached to the idea that value and to the idea of, in the work of Karel Martens, so that these ephemeral or delicate types of work, such as graphic design, that constitutes ephemera, which the word very says, is lost in time or dissolves in time. Why would it be monetary value that was one of the successes of your work with Karel? And can there be other forms of value that could be identified in terms of, I'm not going to say innovation, but perhaps community and interdependence that you've focused throughout your presentation?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not saying that. I think you're picking at a very important point. You're scratching at a point that I think I wanted to put in to kind of, in German you'd use the term irritate. But let's say I think value is on many levels. Value is what you're talking about in terms of cultural discussion and dialogue and conversation. It's about relevance, it's about reference, it's about community, it's about the sense of being seen and also supporting others. And there's also financial value. And so all of those things were important. I mean, just the fact that one of the things that underlay also my decision to include Karel in the first show at P was the fact that I knew that he was not only important for so many designers whom I knew, but there were also many artists whom I knew, to kind of create that somewhat false dichotomy, who really were aware of and interested in his work, but he was somebody who had never been seen. His work had never been, his monoprints had not been exhibited since, I think, 1993 at the Stedelijk Museum. And so for me to show them meant that people could actually engage in a dialogue with them. And I think afterwards, there were so many artists and people who were very inspired by that. So it created that. And of course, through the way that it became a thing that was a discussion on multiple levels, that value was absolutely essential. And I think that Karel also has created community in so many ways. So I myself, when I first started working with Karel and also then began to, for the first time, sell the monoprints, it was a weird, uncomfortable feeling. I had a moment where I thought, these have been things that have circulated as gifts for 20 years, over 20 years, and what does it mean to then turn them into commodities? What does it mean to assign a value to them and begin to sell them? And that sat very, that was a kind of thing I had to sit with. And I don't know the answer. I don't think it's one or the other, but here are a couple of things that it produced. I mean, what it produced is, as I kind of explicitly called out in the presentation, potentially a slight tweak to a historical record, where instead of, we all know that there are dialogues that are happening within any context that are far beyond what happens in a gallery or within the museum's collection. But so often the museum's collection is, as one very limited subset of human experience, it is very, very specific in what it includes and what it leaves out. And so for me, there was a moment of saying, by creating the situation of cultural value and financial value that would allow a museum to purchase this work and treat it as something worthy of preservation, it might rebind certain links and dialogues that have been lost. And to be completely honest, as I was thinking about this and writing this these past days, I thought even if I myself am very happy to no longer be in the position of a commercial gallerist selling art for so many reasons, every gallerist whom I respect, whom I think is doing a great job, they love the work of the artist they're showing, and they feel like what they are doing is something that is not being represented, or that is marginalized, or that is a set of ideas or approaches that ought to be seen by people. And so that kind of question of value in the collection sense, but also the dialogue, is very important. The second point, which is also, I'll say out loud, it's not to be forgotten, is it also, for Karel, produced the ability to actually take on maybe less client commissions or things that he was less excited about. He's now in his 80s, and I think it offered for him an opportunity to actually have recognition for that work and to spend more time doing things that brought him more joy. So that makes me feel good. The third point, which I'm also going to be totally transparent about, is without selling Karel's work, P could never have existed, even past its first year. So without having sold that work, even if we never made a profit in our 5 years, it meant that we made money that we could then reinvest in other artists. We could reinvest it in younger artists who wouldn't have any commercial market, and in exhibitions and curators and communities and dialogues that we found very important.
And I think that that's why the sales go there. Because we're running out of time, I wanted to see if there's any question to Prem from the audience that there is. Otherwise, I'm going to ask one last question. Yes, Bruno? They're going to pass, or they're going to do it.
Yeah. COVID.
Hi, Prem. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's always so fun and inspiring to hear you. It was also inspiring to learn more about Karel's work. I was struck when you were talking about the pedagogical strategies that he used. And I don't want to deviate the conversation away from Karel too much, but I was curious to learn more about your own structures. I'm always fascinated, by the way, how you present and how you organize conversations and how you organize discursive events and how you curate those, and also how you curated the exhibitions at P. I was wondering how your ideas about organizing conversations, and they always emphasize this interdependence and this porosity of self and this relation to others, how it has informed your own pedagogical structures, but also if you could elaborate a bit more how that influences your work at workshops.
Thank you, Bruno. And it's nice to see you in this context. Am I right that you were there at the Apple at the moment when that first was presented? And Karel said to me, well, he gave me some good critique. Let me try to think about it. It's a big question. it's true that, you know, I actually really admire and I'm like almost a little envious of Karel's move to say, his early move to say, I'm going to do the same exercise as my students. I like to subject myself to the same rules as my students, kind of, but I have never gone quite that far. And so it maybe inspires me to think about that as a method. But in general, I mean, it's a challenging thing. I mean, I'm quite aware of the position that I play in a room through any number of factors, whether it's where I come from, my background, my gender, the fact that I happen to have an extremely loud voice because my family is extremely loud, and my sister is a lawyer. But it's meant that I've had to think about, like, the thing that I think is really fascinating for me in Karel, and which I learn from him, is that, like, on the one hand, Karel is really Karel. Like, when you meet Karel, he is himself. He is very much an individual. He has his own strong ideas about things. I know from hearing from other folks, I think he's gotten into some good arguments with a lot of designers over the years about what he thinks is good and bad. But in my experience of him, he's nevertheless still open to these other ideas. And so it's the question, how can you both be a good individual and be porous? And, you know, it's a Grace Doritu, an artist whom I've often collaborated with in different ways. She said to me once, to be a good member of a community, of an experimental community, you have to be a good individual. You have to know your own boundaries in order to know how to work with others. And I think in my own pedagogy, which over the last several years, particularly through the pandemic, has become even more clearly focused, it is about how can you have students or participants or learners develop both a kind of their own individual practice at the same time as they learn how to work with others. What are the ways of communicating and collaborating with others that actually allow you to be a better part of a community so that you can work on more collective and larger scale things? And so I think it's about all of those scales and thinking of teaching as trying to work at those intersections.
I think that this is a wonderful question that you've given, and also a great response, of which we will hear more right now, because the student collective that designed a Documentus identity for next year is about to log in to connect online from Jakarta, and we don't want to keep them waiting because it's very late in the evening there.
I'm so sorry to keep you all up.
It's late in the evening there, but they've prepared a presentation for you all, and so we will hear from them directly from Jakarta, and we will also hear from the group enrolled in Workplatz that created our new visual identity for Kunstinstitut Meli. So we love that there are these two collective groups that have been gathered to create the design not only of our institution but also of Documenta, and that this is happening concurrently from different parts of the world. So we will be meeting them, or at least I will be meeting them for the first time. This is going to be moderated by Jeroen Laven. So Jeroen, we switch places. I will go to the back, he will go to the front, and you're ready, no? So please stay here. There will be a break. The audience is waiting there to come in, and there will be a break afterwards before the next program, okay? Thank you.